Lawyers. What did you have to explain to a complete idiot you were defending? No, you dingus. Self-defense does not mean that he punches you in the face and then 2 weeks later you go to his house, ring his doorbell, and kick the crap out of him. By far and away the strangest thing I've ever had to explain to a client is how to use an elevator. Our courtroom was on the 4th floor, and she needed to take an elevator to get there. I had to describe how you get in, push the 4 button, and then get out when the lights above show she's on floor 4. Yep. The dumbest legal thing I've had to explain is that you can't terminate your parental rights voluntarily and then request visitation with that child. I once had a client who wanted to declare bankruptcy. I explained that he needed to have his tax returns over the past few years filed in order to do so. He said he hadn't filed taxes in 20 years because it ain't none of the government's business how much money I make. I don't understand. People make it sound like the IRS will throw you in a federal penitentiary if you ever dare to not file taxes, but some guy can just not file for 2 decades and have nothing happen to him? Can someone explain to me how that's possible? When I was a legal intern at a criminal defender's law office, we had a client who was charged with murder. We explained to the client not to make any phone calls saying anything incriminating because it will be recorded. Where prisoners can use the phone, there's a giant sign that says, "Phone calls will be recorded." On top of that, before you're able to call out, there's an automated recording that tells you that all calls are being recorded and monitored unless it's to your attorney, which are covered by privilege. A client made a call to his girlfriend that very evening asking her to hide his weapon. I just found out right now what happened to the case. Apparently it was dismissed. The defense attorney was really good. It doesn't matter whether you were sober or not. You jumped out of a 3rd-story window with a beer bottle and threw it at a cop. The jury is going to think you were drunk. Also, I think you were drunk. To be honest, wouldn't proving that they were sober be a much worse thing for this person? I mean, they're in trouble anyway, but surely if someone knows you attacked the police officer while in possession of all your faculties, people have a fairly good indicator that you acted purely vindictively. I had to explain to a client that they had to pay me. This is more common than you'd think. For some reason, some people think lawyers are like their personal spiritual guides or fairy godmother. That you really can go to jail if we lose at trial. Mine's from this week. My client said, "So, I don't smoke crystal, I just think it's from doing the deed unprotected." I answered, "So you'd like me to explain to the judge, it's okay, you just bang crystal heads." Yeah! Not a client per se, but a victim. Had to explain what the correct medical term for the word splooge meant. The defense attorney asked if the defendant splooged, and she said no. On redirect, I explained that the word meant something came out of his private parts, and she said, "Oh, then yes." Not the brightest person I've ever met. That your boss sending you a substance test after he walked in on you snorting white snow off your desk does not qualify as entrapment. You can't sue him. Don't signal to the judge that you need to use the restroom during your trial by making eye contact and vigorously nodding while urgently pointing at your crotch. You should tell your lawyer and let her take care of it. You should definitely not make a break for the door. I went on a date with a lawyer recently who had told me he had to be at work at 9 a.m. the next day to explain to someone that he could, in fact, be fired for killing someone with the company vehicle. I was contacted by a couple who had paid for a trip to see the midnight sun in northern Norway. They wanted to sue the travel agency when they found out it was the same sun that they had back home. I had to explain that there's only a single sun and that they can't sue a travel agency for selling a midnight sun trip. Every year, one of the travel agencies publishes a list of the most ridiculous complaints they've received. They're hilarious. Last year, someone complained that the beach was too sandy. Another good one was that they hadn't told the couple that a lot of the beaches can be, undressed, and the husband became, quote, distracted. I work on appeals, which means that I spend more time with the law than with real people. But the law has some gems, like this one guy who really happened. Document reads, At the police station, the arresting officer advised defendant, both orally and with a consent form, of his constitutional rights pursuant to Miranda v. Arizona, 384 U.S., bunch of numbers, 1966. Defendant refused to sign the consent form and stated that he would never waive his rights. At the same time, however, he asked the arresting officer whether he could speak to him man to man. At this point, a detective with the task force entered the room with the evidence of the substances gathered from the inventory search of the Corvette and advised the defendant of the charges that would be filed against him. To this, the defendant responded, "You think this is big time? This ain't crap." The detective then asked the defendant whether he was willing to provide them with any information, and the defendant responded that if he were released with his substances in his possession that night, he had called the police occasionally with information on certain persons he felt needed to be off the streets. The detective then started to leave the booking area, and the defendant said, "And I want my stuff back." When the detective asked him whether he was referring to the substances discovered in the Corvette, the defendant responded that he was. File that under, "You should definitely exercise the right to remain silent." I had to tell mine why they shouldn't have called the cops to tell them exactly what they did that violated the restraining order. A lawyer can't out and lie for a client. If you said to them, "Yeah, I burned his frickin' house down and weed on the ashes," then he can't say that you were 2 states away. That blew some of my students' minds. When I was volunteering at teen court in college, I had a kid who burned down a few hundred acres and a half-dozen houses. As soon as I went, "Let's talk about how to handle this," he went, "I did it. I was bored and I wanted to see if I could catch the field on fire, and then when it spread, I figured, frick it, they have insurance, and I left without calling the cops." Totally confused when I told the judge I need to be relieved after he started lying his butt off about it in court. In my state, we have this thing called victim's compensation. An oversimplification of how it works goes as follows. If you're the victim of a crime and suffer some form of injury, like a psychological, physical, etc., you can apply for a payment from state funds. If you're the perpetrator of one of those crimes, like an assault, robbery, unwanted advances of a serious nature, an order can be made for you to pay the state back an amount relating to the victim's compensation. I had a client who felt the process of being convicted for attacking his relatives and having to pay victim's compensation back to the state was arduous, and in return, he should be receiving victim's compensation from the state. So that was fun to explain. By his logic, his victims got compensation and that was unfair. He didn't at all grasp the logic that his victims had been badly injured by his conduct for which he had been convicted. Although I'm sure his victims weren't the nicest people, they hadn't attacked him. I gather he hadn't grasped he'd done anything wrong. I had a client once who was in trouble for stealing sample medications from a hospital. We got security footage from the DA as part of the evidence, and when it came down, we watched it together. The camera was literally 10 feet away in a well-lit room, and we watched her shovel prescription samples into a garbage bag and walk off. After it was done, she turned to me and asked if I thought she was going to be able to get off. I said no. Honestly, the DA was being super nice. She had pulled this trick 2 days in a row and got caught, and they were doing them as 2 separate charges. Combined, it would make it a felony, but instead it was only facing like 2 years in prison. I had a deal worked out to get it down to 6 months. And this lady fired me because she thought she could get off without anything. The DA let me know that no offer would be available to her after that move. I wonder if there's any lawyer alive who'd confidently tell their client that they could get away scot-free when there was video evidence of them committing said crime. Oh, and I mean a regular person, not one of the super rich. They get away with this crap all the time. Not to a client, but other party. I was acting for a particular manufacturer. They were sued for an injury incurred by someone using a product made by a different manufacturer. I rang their lawyer and said I was acting for them, but I didn't understand why they'd been named as a defendant in the suit, but the body of the claim said the plaintiff had been injured by a product made by manufacturer B. I asked if it was a monster typo or what. The response was that they thought that manufacturer A was the manufacturer of the products sold under the name of manufacturer B. Now, that isn't inherently stupid, I guess, so I said they had no basis in fact whatsoever, and that A and B were unrelated competitors. And I asked, as a matter of curiosity, how they'd reached the conclusion that A were the manufacturer of B. The response was along the lines of, someone in the office, I think it was maybe Jim, one of our clerks, who thought he'd read somewhere that B was made by A. That was it. No checking of the product paperwork, no company searches, no brand name register searches, no inquiries with our client or B, not even frickin' Google, just some guy in the office had once heard something. And on that basis, they'd issued a very financially sizable product liability suit. I once had to explain to a client that he could in fact fire an employee for 1. Stealing significant sums of money from the safe, 2. For pulling a weapon on a coworker who questioned these activities, and 3. Waving said piece in a customer's face moments later, all of which were on camera. I processed a case where a woman sued her lawyers after a divorce because they didn't explain to her that divorcing her husband meant she'd no longer be married. I recently had a call from a guy who found out that Long John Silver's was microwaving his baked shrimp combo. He wanted to eat there for every meal for a year and then sue them for false advertising. He changed his mind when I suggested that he'd probably die of a heart attack before reaching his 1-year goal. I watched a Florida Supreme Court appeal over a murder case. The guy killed several people with a baseball bat and wanted his sentence mitigated because he had PTSD. He claimed he had PTSD from experiencing the murder he committed. The court had to explain to him that a mental issue acquired while committing a crime can't mitigate you from the crime you committed. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. When a client called me this past Memorial Day and I asked why she was calling me on a holiday, she replied that she didn't think Jews celebrated Memorial Day. I never thought that I'd have to explain that to anyone. To answer some of the questions, yes, I am Jewish. No, I never told her I was Jewish. I have an answering service which took her call and emailed me the message, which was that it was very urgent that she speak to me that day. Given the courts were closed and her case was a paternity and child support matter, I thought it had to be quite the emergency. Turns out it wasn't. She just wanted to ask whether the suspected father was required to take the DNA test ordered by the court. I then had to explain what paternity meant. Not the dumbest, but the one I have the most problem with is attorney-client privilege. It's only a secret and safe from discovery from the other side if you keep it a secret. Don't forward my emails to other people. Don't talk about your case. Keep it a secret. That the presence of the yellow fringe on the flags in the courtroom doesn't mean that the court is an admiralty court without jurisdiction to hear the client's criminal case. Sovereign citizens are something else. I was clerking in a bankruptcy court and we had a case where the petitioners were a group of men that had a mix of ideologies between sovereign citizenship, the redemption movement, and strawman theory. They believed that an individual has 2 personas, one the real flesh and blood human being and the other a separate legal personality or person, usually written in capitals, who is the strawman, and that the strawman is responsible for all their debts, liabilities, taxes, and legal responsibilities belonging to the strawman rather than the physical individual themselves. Also, that when you're born, the government puts $630,000 in an account for this strawman and somehow you can write checks off that account using the UCC? Basically, the petitioners went into a Cadillac dealership and presented these strawman checks and demanded cars. The dealership called the cops and they were arrested for fraud. Then the petitioners attempted to force the dealership into involuntary bankruptcy so they could get the cars. There were 3 petitioners and they were all pro se, so needless to say the motions were ridiculous and unintelligible. And this was on my 2nd day as a clerk. Sovereign citizens really just are fascinating case studies of human behavior. They heard an argument that sounded interesting, decided that it must be true, and refused to neither hear out the possibility that they were wrong, nor look at the fact that I believe any of their arguments have ever in history carried water in a court of law. It's wild. I had a mediation last week with a client on a really crappy case and managed to settle for a decent amount. I then explained to the plaintiff her share of the settlement after paying the bill. She was confused, so I explained that I was speaking about our fee and expenses. She got really upset because we were taking her money. I had to explain what a contingency contract was and how we were compensated for our services. The conversation took a turn for the absurd when I had to explain I don't work for free. I once had to explain what a maiden name was because they had no idea. Similarly, with a different client, I tried to explain why they needed to fill out the intake questionnaire. I was explaining that I needed information such as their name, address, and date of birth in order to draft paperwork. Their response? Why do I have to do this? What did I even hire you for? You're useless. If I have to do all this work, I might as well represent myself. They were super angry and stormed out the front door. Sorry, I don't magically know your date of birth. As for the maiden name, it was a very small country town. This person was most definitely a native English speaker. As for the questionnaire, someone asked why we don't just ask for a driver's license. The questionnaire was about 2 or 3 pages long and also needed other information such as any previous names, social security number, children's names, among other things. Well, from the other side, I once missed a court date and assumed that it had put me in even deeper legal doo-doo, and my lawyer then had to explain to me that dodging his calls to avoid being arrested was just dumb and the exact wrong course of action. If it helps, we get it all the time as lawyers, and the law profession is full of those with anxiety or depression, which are both issues that can make you want to avoid facing stuff. Personally, I totally get why my clients would avoid the crap out of their problems. I hate opening my mail, but I tell my clients on the regular not to avoid theirs. So your attorney didn't necessarily think you were an idiot, he would have just cringed at the hole he knew that you were digging for yourself. A friend of my dad once tried to sue him. Why? Because this friend's dad had died, and since my dad was like a father to his friend, he should just give him money every month just like his dad did when he was alive. Apparently the lawyer just said, "That's not how it works." I have to explain to clients on a daily basis that yes, you do actually have to pay for that house you're buying. If your mortgage company hasn't given us the money yet or you didn't arrange for them to give enough money, then you can't pay for the house and the house is not yours. And no, I can't give you keys to the house before it's yours. I once had to explain to opposing counsel that his entire argument was wrong because he'd cited a statute for chattels, not real property. It was a case involving a land contract. I used to be a legal aid lawyer, so sometimes I had sovereign citizens come in for help. I'd have to explain that their magic words wouldn't solve anything and they were going to get evicted. If they wouldn't agree to negotiate for settlement, I wouldn't represent them because they never had any real defenses, and we didn't have the resources to litigate impossible cases. Bankruptcy attorney here. If you know you're coming into my office to file bankruptcy, do not make major financial decisions before you talk to me. For example, cashing out your 401k, paying your family members the money you owe them, or buying a car with no intention of paying off the loan. The court allows you to discharge your debt, and the only thing they ask is for you to be honest and not sneaky about it. You've got to respect the process. I worked in bankruptcy in Canada for many years. There was a company going under, but the director couldn't physically sign until Monday and didn't want the staff to know because half is his family. We allow him to stay open for the weekend with one stipulation: only cash and carry sales because he can't take deposits as he won't be ordering items. It's illegal to take money when you know you won't provide the goods. He instructs his staff, who obey him. On Monday morning, he opens at 8 and takes cash and credit deposits for 3 hours until the trustee shows up with the documents. The tip of the iceberg of the crap show for that file was that he said, "You only said weekends, so I operated as business as usual this morning and took a few $1,000s in orders." I mean, I'm not a smart guy, but as a small business owner, that's the biggest brain moment. The place had to be a certain size to be employing multiple people, and not being able to follow such a simple instruction or realize why trying to trick the system is such a bad idea is just breathtaking. Not the lawyer, I'm the other side of the lawsuit for this piece of work. Obviously, I'm trying not to reveal details, sorry, but it's still going on. So far, we, the judge, his lawyer, I want to say it's been 9 different lawyers now, have had to explain to him the following. The statute of limitations. Lawyers quit if you don't pay them. My lawyer cannot advise him. He has to pay the court fees. Lawyers quit if you don't pay them. If you fire your lawyer when suing as a corporation, you'll be kicked out. Lawyers quit if you don't pay them. Statute of limitations again. My lawyer cannot advise him. That during discovery he handed over emails that had the actual date of a meeting instead of the month earlier that he'd been claiming. Lawyers quit if you don't pay them. Statute of limitations. Yes, the judge can go off the record and berate you for 15 minutes if she thinks it helps the case. My lawyer will laugh in your face for asking for advice about the judge. His lawyer needs his actual address, not just a FedEx store where he picks up his mail periodically. The court isn't going to bother calling each of the 8 different cell numbers that just might be the one you currently have active. Lawyers quit if you don't pay them. My lawyer cannot advise him. The reading of the settlement and agreeing to it on record in court is binding. Simply saying that a person is the attorney doesn't actually make them the attorney, there's actual paperwork. My lawyer cannot advise him. Lawyers quit if you don't pay them. The ruling was against him and he can't sell what was never his. He needs to actually pay the court fees for his appeal. He needs an attorney for the appeal because corporations must be represented by an attorney in court. He needs to file the paperwork required for an appeal. He still needs an attorney for the appeal because corporations still have to be represented by an attorney in court. My lawyer cannot advise him. Yes, Rule 8.140A1 really does mean you're about to be kicked out permanently. By October 28th, he needs to have an attorney and pay the court fees and file his paperwork, or his appeal goes away. And lastly, just because I feel like it needs another one, lawyers quit if you don't pay them. Simply because that's how he went through so many of them. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out easymode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.